On the 15th of October, 1066, the sun rose over a field outside Hastings. 7,000 men lay dead. Among them, the last Anglo-Saxon king of England. But Hastings wasn't the end. It was the beginning. What happened next wasn't a change of government. It was the systematic erasure of an entire civilization. Within 20 years, every Saxon lord in England would be replaced. Every major building would be demolished and rebuilt. The language of power would change. The law would change. The meaning of land, who owned it, who worked it, who was allowed to hunt on it, would change completely. The people who lived through it had no idea how total the transformation would be. They thought they'd lost a battle. They'd actually lost their country. Using AI reconstruction, I'm going to show you what happened to England after Hastings. From the burning of the Saxon halls to the stone castles that replaced them. From the harrying of the north that killed 100,000 people to the Domesday Book that counted every surviving pig. This is the conquest no one talks about. Not the battle, the occupation. To understand what the Normans destroyed, you need to see what was there. Saxon England in 1066 was not primitive. It was one of the most sophisticated administrative states in Europe. It had a functioning tax system, a national currency, the silver penny, controlled from a single mint. It had a legal code, a network of shires and hundreds, and a literacy rate among its clergy that was the envy of the continent. Saxon villages were built from timber and thatch. The Great Hall, the center of community life, was where the Lord ate with his people, where disputes were settled, where stories were told around the fire. The relationship between a Saxon thane and his tenants was hierarchical, but personal. They spoke the same language. They worshipped in the same church. They knew each other's names. Land was held through a web of obligation and custom that had evolved over centuries. A freeman could own land, pass it to his children, and defend his rights in a local court. The system wasn't equal. There were slaves, there were poor, but it was familiar. People understood the rules. In the space of 20 years, every single one of those rules would be rewritten by men who didn't speak their language. The first thing the Normans built wasn't a church or a town. It was a castle. Within weeks of Hastings, William began constructing motte and bailey fortifications across southern England. The design was brutally efficient. A mound of earth, the motte, raised 30 to 40 feet high, topped with a wooden tower. Surrounded by a ditch and a palisade enclosing a yard, the bailey. An entire castle could be built in 2 weeks using forced local labor. The Saxons had nothing like them. Saxon England had no castles. Defense was communal. The burh, a fortified town with shared walls. The idea of a single lord sitting inside a private fortress looking down on the town below was alien. And that was exactly the point. By 1070, William had built castles at Warwick, Nottingham, York, Lincoln, Huntingdon, and Cambridge. Each one was planted in or beside an existing Saxon town. Houses were demolished to make room. In Lincoln, 166 houses were destroyed for the castle site. In Norwich, 113. In Shrewsbury, 51. The Normans didn't build beside the Saxons, they built on top of them. And then came the stone. The White Tower, the great keep of the Tower of London, was begun around 1078. 90 feet tall, walls 15 feet thick at the base, built from Caen limestone shipped across the Channel from Normandy. It was the largest secular building in England, and it was built by Saxon hands. The labor was forced. Local men, the same men whose farms had been seized, were conscripted to quarry, carry, and lay the stone. They were building the symbol of their own subjugation. And every Saxon who looked up at those white walls understood exactly what they meant. A wooden Saxon hall said, "We live here together." A Norman stone keep said, "I rule here, you obey." The North refused to submit. In 1069, 3 years after Hastings, the north of England rose against William. Edgar Atheling, the last surviving male of the Saxon royal house, allied with Danish invaders and Northumbrian rebels. They retook York. They massacred the Norman garrison. For a brief moment, it looked like the conquest might be reversed. William's response was the worst atrocity committed on English soil in the Middle Ages. He paid the Danes to leave. Then he turned on the English. Over the winter of 1069 to 1070, his armies marched from York to Durham, burning every village they found, every farmstead, every grain store, every plow, every mill. Livestock was slaughtered in the fields. Food stores were set ablaze. Tools were smashed so that even if people survived, they couldn't farm. The timing was deliberate. Winter. No crops would grow for months. No food could be found. William wasn't just punishing rebellion. He was engineering famine. The Norman chronicler Orderic Vitalis, a man who admired William, wrote that more than 100,000 people perished of starvation. Modern historians debate the number, but tens of thousands is not disputed. The scale is confirmed by what happened next. When the Domesday Book was compiled 16 years later, 1/3 of all recorded land in Yorkshire was still listed as waste, depopulated, uncultivated, empty. Simeon of Durham wrote that no village was inhabited between York and Durham. The land was empty for 9 years. William's own biographers, men paid to praise him, called it a stain upon his soul. On his deathbed, William reportedly confessed to having cruelly oppressed the native inhabitants beyond all reason. The harrying of the North didn't just defeat a rebellion, it erased a population, and it worked. The North never rose again. After the burning came the counting. In 1085, William ordered the most comprehensive survey ever attempted in medieval Europe. Every manor, every farm, every field, every pig, cow, sheep, and plow, every mill and fish pond, every person who held land and how much that land was worth, both before the conquest and now. The English called it the Domesday Book, the Day of Judgment, because, like the Last Judgment, there was no appeal. The survey was conducted by teams of commissioners who rode from shire to shire, questioning local juries under oath. How much land does this manor hold? How many plows? How many villagers? How many slaves? What was it worth in the time of King Edward? What is it worth now? The answers told a devastating story. Across vast areas of England, the value of land had collapsed. In Yorkshire, manors that had been worth 20 shillings in 1066 were worth nothing in 1086. The word waste appears hundreds of times in the Yorkshire entries. 20 years later, the harrying was still visible in the accounts. But the Domesday Book wasn't an act of sympathy. It was an act of control. William wanted to know exactly what England was worth so he could tax it. Every acre, every animal, every person was assigned a value. The survey turned a conquered nation into a spreadsheet. Here's the detail that captures it. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle recorded that it was shameful to relate, but William thought it no shame to do. Not a single ox, cow, or pig was left out. An entire country reduced to an inventory.
17 chickens. These 7 sacks of wheat are accounted.
And the land that had belonged to 2,000 Saxon lords now belonged to roughly 200 Norman barons. The most complete transfer of wealth in English history documented in a single book. Before the Normans, the forests of England belonged to everyone. Saxon freemen hunted deer, boar, and game birds on common land. Forests provided fuel, building timber, and food. The right to hunt was assumed, part of the fabric of daily survival. William ended that overnight. The royal forests, and forest in Norman law didn't mean woodland, it meant any land reserved for the king's hunting, including open heath and farmland, were placed under a separate legal code, the Forest Law. Killing a deer in the king's forest carried the penalty of blinding. A second offense meant death. William created the new forest in Hampshire by evicting entire communities. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle recorded that he destroyed over 20 settlements, villages, churches, farmsteads, so that he could hunt deer. People who had lived on that land for generations were removed so that the king could enjoy his sport. The forest wardens, Norman appointees, had the power to arrest, fine, and mutilate any Saxon found hunting, gathering wood, or even letting their pigs forage in royal forest. A starving man who killed a rabbit to feed his family could lose his eyes. The message was clear. The land you walked on, the animals you hunted, the wood you burned, none of it was yours anymore. Everything belonged to the king, including you. The Normans had a problem. Their soldiers kept dying, not in battle, in the dark. A Norman knight found dead in a ditch, a tax collector who never arrived, a garrison soldier whose body turned up in a field with a knife in his back. The Saxons couldn't fight the Norman army, but they could kill individual Normans when no one was looking. William's solution was the Murdrum fine. If a Norman was found dead and the killer could not be identified within 5 days, the entire 100, the local administrative district, was fined collectively. Everyone paid, whether they were involved or not. The fine was enormous, 46 marks of silver, enough to bankrupt a community. And here's the detail that reveals the racial logic. If the community could prove the dead man was English, not Norman, the fine was canceled. A dead Englishman was free, a dead Norman cost everyone. The Murdrum fine tells you everything about the relationship between conqueror and conquered. The Normans were so outnumbered and so hated that they needed a specific law to stop the local population from picking them off one by one in the darkness. It also tells you something about the Saxons. They were losing the war, but they hadn't stopped fighting.
11th century England.
Within a generation of Hastings, every position of power in England was held by someone who spoke French. Every bishop, every abbot, every sheriff, every earl, every judge. The entire ruling class was replaced by men who conducted their business in Norman French and recorded it in Latin. English, the language of Alfred the Great, of Beowulf, of 1,000 years of literature, became the language of peasants. If you needed to plead your case in court, you needed French. If you wanted to petition the king, you needed French. If you wanted to understand the law that governed your land, your family, and your freedom, you needed a language you had never been taught. Here's where the scar is still visible. The English language split along class lines, and it never fully healed. The animal in the field kept its Saxon name: cow, sheep, pig, deer. The meat on the table took the French name: beef, mutton, pork, venison. The people who raised the animals spoke English. The people who ate them spoke French. The legal system is the same. Saxon words survived for crime and punishment: murder, steal, guilt. But the language of the court is French to this day. Judge, jury, verdict, attorney, plaintiff, defendant, justice. Every time you walk into an English courtroom, you're hearing the linguistic echo of the Norman Conquest. The Saxons didn't abandon their language, they kept speaking it. At home, in the fields, in the alehouse. English survived because the conquered refused to stop using it. But it came back changed. Roughly 10,000 French words entered English in the centuries after 1066. The language that emerged, Middle English, was neither Saxon nor French. It was the sound of two cultures forced into the same throat. William died in 1087, 21 years after Hastings. According to the chronicles, his body was so bloated that it burst the stone sarcophagus at his funeral. The man who had broken England couldn't even be contained by his own coffin. But the England he created outlasted him. The feudal system he imposed, lord, vassal, tenant, structured English society for 400 years. The castles he built became the seats of power that defined English politics through the Middle Ages. The Domesday Book became the legal foundation of English land ownership, and parts of it were cited in property disputes into the 20th century. And the Saxons? They didn't vanish. They became the English. The language survived. The local customs survived. The parish boundaries survived, many of them unchanged since before the Conquest. The common law that would eventually limit royal power drew on Saxon precedent as much as Norman innovation. Magna Carta, the document that would define English liberty, was written by the descendants of Norman barons in a language shaped by Saxon survival. The conquest was total, but the survival was also total. The Normans couldn't erase the Saxons any more than the Saxons could expel the Normans. What emerged was something neither side intended: England. You can still see where this happened. The White Tower still stands. The Domesday Book is in the National Archives at Kew. The New Forest is still there, still royal land 960 years later. And at Battle Abbey in Sussex, a plaque marks the spot where Harold fell, the place where Saxon England ended and something new, something brutal and brilliant and contradictory, began. If you haven't seen the battle that started all of this, watch my Battle of Hastings video next. And tell me in the comments, do you think England would have been better off if Harold had won? Or was the conquest the painful foundation that made everything after it possible? And if this changed how you see 1066, subscribe. There's a lot more buried English history to reconstruct. Thanks for watching.